The Ruy Lopez begins after the moves 1, e4, black pawn to e5, white knight to f3, black knight to c6, and now bishop from f1 to b5. This opening was not one of the most popular in earlier times, mainly because many people failed to see the point of the move bishop b5. It does follow opening principles, it develops a piece and prepares for castling, but most people would prefer to place the bishop on c4, where it strikes at the weak pawn at f7, and is also more centrally placed. As time passed, however, people realized that the early attacks against the f7 square were quite likely to rebound, since they broke the underlying positional rule of not attacking too early and waiting until your development is complete. So attention was shifted towards obtaining a central advantage rather than launching a direct attack. And here people discover that the bishop at c4 was quite often badly placed, as it formed a target for the black central attack by pawn from d7 to d5. Now, because of these rather obscure reasons, which you'll understand once you've made a study of the Gyoko piano and the two knights defense, the Ruy Lopez became more popular, and it stayed the more popular to the present day. Now let's look at the position with the bishop at b5. This bishop has a half pin on the knight at c6 and the pawn at d7. And besides the half pin, there's also a half threat to win the pawn at e5 by bishop takes c6 and knight takes e5. However, as we'll see later, this is only a half threat. Underlying the bishop move is the idea of weakening black's hold on the central squares, for the knight at c6 is threatened, and it is this knight that's controlling the two center squares at e5 and d4. White's overriding plan for the opening, besides the normal completion of his development, and that means, of course, castling and clearing the pieces off the back rank and connecting the rooks. Right, his main plan is to play for a center with the moves c3 and d4, pawn to c3. In fact, this plan of playing in the center is more important than the plan of development of the pieces, because in the main line white often obtains the pawn center, but two of his queenside pieces, the knight at b1 and the bishop at c1, are as yet unmoved, and of course that means that the rook at a1 is also unmoved. Now this inactivity is particularly depressing for the knight at b1, since his ideas of useful employment are harmed by white having a pawn at c3, and so the knight often has to get in to play via d2 and then maybe f1. Despite these drawbacks, the Ruy Lopez is one of the most popular of modern openings, which shows, I suppose, that development is not everything, and pawn control of the center, if anything, is more important. Now let's go through the main line of the Ruy Lopez and follow White's ideas. Later we'll be able to look at the sidelines, and many of these lead to completely different formations. After White plays bishop to b5, Black often moves pawn to a6, and White retreats the bishop to a4. Now White could play bishop takes c6, so let's make that move. Bishop takes c6, and Black replies d takes c6. White knight takes on e5, and White has won a pawn. But turn off the tape and decide how Black regains it. Black can play queen to d4, attacking both the knight at e5 and the pawn at e4, and he regains his lost material. And besides playing queen d4, he could also move his queen to g5. That attacks the pawn at g2 and the knight at e5. That also regains the pawn, though it is not a center pawn. Now let's return those pieces to the situation before bishop takes c6. So black queen back to d8, white knight back to f3, black pawns on e5 and d7, white bishop at a4, black knight at c6. Now if white isn't going to gain a pawn, there's not much point in trading a bishop for a knight by bishop takes c6. So we'll continue with the main line after bishop to a4. Black now plays knight to f6, attacking the white pawn at e4, and now switch off and decide how you would defend the pawn. If you remember our original plan, then you'll recall that we said that white's plan was to build the pawn center by the moves c3 and d4. Now, if he tries to guard his pawn at e4 by playing knight to c3 or pawn to d3, he'll find that his plan will be much slower to accomplish, and of course after knight c3 it will be probably impossible, because the knight is occupying the square the pawn is meant to go to. Therefore, white solves the problem by not actually defending his pawn. He plays castles kingside. When we go over the sidelines, we shall look at the move black knight takes e4. But meanwhile, we'll continue with the main line, where black plays bishop to e7. And the idea of this move is simply to clear the back row and to allow for castling. You might wonder, why didn't black put his bishop at c5 instead of on e7? But the reason for this is that he doesn't want it to be attacked when white later expands by playing c3 and pawn to d4. So again, it's okay to try and put your pieces in the center, but it's not a good idea if they get attacked by enemy pawns. That's why this modest development of the bishop to e7 is far superior to bishop c5. Now after black plays bishop e7, white plays rook to e1, finally guarding the pawn at e4. And he is actually now threatening to capture at c6 with the bishop. Now let's see why this is so. Say black castled here. White plays bishop takes c6. Black d takes c6. White knight takes e5. And now black tries his trick of playing queen to d4. Now this does indeed attack the knight and the pawn at e4, but it's not as strong as before. White can move his knight back to f3, attacking the black queen, and black is unable to capture the pawn at e4. He has to move his queen away, after which white will be able to guard his pawn and stay a pawn up. Now let's return those pieces. Black queen back to d8, black pawns on e5, d7, and black knight at c6. White has a bishop at a4. Right, and black, let's uncastle black, of course. Right, so black must defend his pawn at e5, and he usually plays here b7 to b5, which drives the bishop away. Bishop goes back to b3. Black plays pawn to d6 here. And now white plays pawn to c3, which not only threatens to play pawn to d4, but also gives the bishop at b3 a bolt hole in case it gets attacked by the black knight coming to a5. Now white could of course have played d4 straight away, but he wants to be able to recapture with a pawn. If black captures on d4 himself, he doesn't want to recapture with a piece. So that's why he's playing c3. After c3, black castles, and now white still delays pawn to d4, because if he plays it straight away, black will play bishop to g4, pinning his knight at f3 and weakening the white control of the d4 square. So white first plays pawn to h3 to stop this bishop pin. Black now plays knight a5, white bishop c2, black pawn to c5. Black has acquired for himself quite a large amount of space in the board with his pawn advances, but white now makes his advance pawn to d4. And here, though we see that black could eliminate both the white center pawns by playing pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, he is unlikely to do so, as this will leave him with an isolated pawn at d6. So instead of capturing the pawn, black usually chooses to strong point his e5 square. He plays queen to c7. White was threatening to capture on c5 twice and win a pawn, so queen c7 guards this pawn and keeps black even in the center in pawns. Also, the queen comes onto a file which is likely to be opened by pawn exchanges. Black often does some work with his major pieces down the c-file. Now the game is just beginning, and as I mentioned earlier, though white's built a pawn center, his development is lagging, particularly his knight at b1. This piece usually comes out via d2 and then f1, and then goes to g3 or e3. And on those squares, it has got some work to do, because particularly on e3, it may go into the d5 square, which is a square possible outpost for the white knight. While all this is happening, the pawns in the center can take up any number of different formations. White can block the position by playing d4 to d5 and then try a queenside or a kingside attack. He can swap at c5 or e5 and try and play down the open d-file. Black himself sometimes swaps by playing c5 takes d4, and then he tries to attack down the open c-file. At other times, black masses for a central advance, trying to play d6 to d5, leading to massive swaps of pawns in the middle of the board. Now these battles usually build up to really gigantic struggles. They build up slowly, and then they reach a climax, as you may have seen from many of the Karpov-Kasparov games. The positions are immensely complicated and need tremendous skill to play well. Now, having looked at the main line, we should look now at the sidelines. So return to the position after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5. Now on move 3, black doesn't have to play a6, though this is the most popular. He can try other defenses. For example, he could play d6, which is the old Steinitz. He could play knight f6, that is the Berlin. He can play knight d4, the bird's defense, not one I think very highly of. And recently he could try knight ge7. I think even g6 is being played. There's also the hyper-aggressive Schliemann defense, which begins with the move 3f5, counterattacking against the white center. However, let's play the move a6, bishop to a4, and I'd like to look at a sideline here, not because it's very important, but because it helps us to understand the re-Lopez. After bishop a4, black could play an immediate pawn to b5, driving the bishop away. Bishop goes back to b3, and at first sight this looks like white has lost a lot of time moving his bishop around. On the other hand, though, black's pawn moves haven't increased his control of the center, and they haven't helped to develop the pieces that much. So possibly this is not such a disadvantage for white. Now the second question here is, why can't black play knight to a5? And this will presumably get the bishop swapped off, and black will gain the advantage of the two bishops. Now white cannot play knight takes e5 here and hope to gain an advantage. After knight takes e5, black will play knight takes b3. White plays a2 takes b3, but black can easily get his pawn back. He can play queen e7, white d4, black d6, and next move black plays queen takes e4 check, regaining his pawn. Right, let's return those pieces. White knight back to f3, white pawn back to d2, another white pawn on a2, white pawn on e4, white bishop is on b3. The black knight is on a5, and his pawns are on e5 and d7, and his queen should be on d8. Now, after black has played knight to a5, white cannot win a pawn, but what he does is to go for central domination, and black has essentially deserted the center by playing his knight to a5. So white plays pawn to d4 here. Black carries on with his plan. Knight takes b3, white a takes b3, black e5 takes d4. He can't maintain the pawn in the center, it's attacked twice. White queen takes d4, even better than knight takes d4. And white has a very powerful position in the center, which more than outweighs the fact that he's lost a bishop for a knight. Now the reason I went through this line is to show you the positional sort of exchanges which are made in the re-Lopez. The idea of exchanging a knight for a bishop and the idea of central control. These two factors are quite important. Right, please return to the position on move 3 after white's bishop b5. Switch off if necessary to do so. Now after bishop b5, pawn to a6, bishop a4, knight f6. White now castles. And now let's look at what's called the open variation when black plays knight takes e4. Now the problem for white is not so much to regain his pawn, he can do that quite easily, but how does he retain some positional advantage at the same time? Now if he answers knight takes e4 by the obvious rook e1, his game fizzles out a bit. Black will play knight c5, attacking the bishop at a4. White maybe plays bishop takes c6. Black pawn takes c6. White knight takes e5. Now black can play bishop to e7. And there's not much white can do about stopping black from castling. And after that, black may even have the better game because he has two active bishops against white's knights, and white's position is still slightly undeveloped on the queen side. Let's return some of those pieces. Black bishop back to f8, black pawn back to d7, black pawn onto e5, and the black knights are on e4 and c6. White bishop on a4, white knight on f3. Now, instead of playing the move rook e1, yes, let's put that rook back on f1. Instead of playing rook e1 after black's knight takes e4, instead white plays pawn to d4. And black would be ill-advised to capture this pawn. If he does so, pawn takes pawn, white would play rook e1, and he would very likely win that knight at e4 due to the pin, player later f3. So black should not take that pawn on d4. Instead, black stabilizes his center position by playing pawn to b5, white bishop to b3, black pawn to d5. White plays pawn takes on e5, d4 takes e5. This discovers an attack on the black pawn at d5, and black plays bishop to e6. And this way black establishes a very strong sort of linking situation with the bishop e6, the pawn d5, and the knight e4. And this is quite hard for white to break down. White usually continues by playing moves like c3, queen e2, knight d2, first to eliminate the knight at e4, and then white tries to go for a kingside attack with using, of course, the space advantage given to him by his pawn at e5. Now black has many active plans in this position as well, and the open variation has proved a very reliable defense to the reload pairs. Now, if you want to find out more about the open variation, then probably the best source is the games played between Karpov and Korchnoi in their World Championship matches. Meanwhile, please return to the position after move 3, after white has played his bishop to b5. Now, there's another interesting way for black to play against the reload pairs, and this means that he waits until white's played the pawn c3 move, and at that moment white is at his worst for development, and then black pounces with a central break, pawn to d5, sacrificing a pawn and releasing all his pieces for a kingside attack. This is called the Marshall attack, and we'll see how it actually is played. Black plays pawn to a6, white bishop to a4. Black plays knight to f6 and white castles. Now, instead of knight takes e4, black plays bishop to e7, white rook e1, now threatening, of course, to play bishop takes c6 and knight takes e5. So black plays b5, white bishop back to b3, and black now castles, doesn't play d6. White makes the move pawn to c3. Now this is the moment where black chooses to pounce. He plays pawn d7 to d5. White e4 takes d5, black knight f6 takes d5. Now white's able to win the pawn. He can play knight takes e5, black knight takes e5, white rook takes e5. threatening as well to, of course, win the knight at d5. In the earliest game played in this variation, which was between Capablanca and Marshall, Marshall moved his knight back to f6 here, and later played bishop d6, knight g4, and queen to h4, which you can see is a very powerful attack. But Capablanca nonetheless managed to beat the attack off, and eventually won the game. Since then, the more popular line has been for black to play pawn to c6 here. Rather than retreating his knight, white continues d4, black goes bishop to d6, attacking the rook, and the rook comes back to e1. Now black launches his attack with queen h4. You can see in this position white's defensive pieces seem to be only his 3 pawns on f2, g2 and h2. All the rest of his pieces are stuck out on the other side of the board. In some ways it's quite surprising that he even survives this attack, but the pawns do manage to hold the black pieces back. White plays pawn to g3, only move really. If he plays pawn to h3, no doubt black will sacrifice with bishop takes h3. So pawn to g3, black now goes queen to h3. Now white tries to develop as quickly as possible. Plays bishop c1 to e3. Black moves bishop from c8 to g4. And white again must be very careful with this pawn structure. f3 here would be fatal after bishop takes g3. So instead white plays queen d1 to d3. Black moves rook from a8 to e8. And white knight b1 to d2. Of course, had black moved his bishop into f3 last move, white would have been able to stop the mate by moving his queen back to f1. So white isn't at least mated. So after knight b1 to d2, one of the variations goes rook e6, and now white tries to chip away at the black position on the queen side by playing a2 to a4, black f7 to f5. He still has his ideas of checkmate against white. White plays queen f1, trying to swap the queens. Black queen back to h5, and now f2 to f4. Very cunning move. Black isn't able here to capture the bishop on e3 because of the diagonal from the bishop at b3 is been opened. Black plays rook f8 to e8, and instead of saving his bishop, white continues pawn takes on b5, black rook takes on e3, white rook takes on e3, black rook takes on e3, now white b takes on a6. This pawn's now threatening to queen, so black puts his bishop back to b8. White pushes on pawn to a7. Bishop takes pawn on a7. Rook takes on a7. And things look serious for black. He's a couple of pawns down, but his next move keeps up the pressure. Queen to e8, threatening rook e1, winning the white queen. White moves his rook back to a1, black plays rook e2, and after knight to c4 we reach a very unclear position where black still has good pressure for his lost pawns. Now if you want to study the Relopiz further, there were several audio chess tapes on this opening. For a start, there's the tape by Andrew Martin called The Relopiz, which is a general survey of the opening, lasting 90 minutes as opposed to the half an hour which I've given on this tape. Besides that, there's a very excellent and detailed survey of the open Lopez, also by Andrew Martin, in the Audio Chess series. And finally, there's a tape on a variation called the Re-Lopez center game. Now, I haven't discussed this yet, but I will explain the basic ideas now. So please return your pieces to the position after white has played bishop to b5 on move 3. And the line continues pawn to a6, white bishop to a4, black knight to f6, white castles, black plays bishop e7. Now the main lines of the Re-Lopez see white playing the move c3 followed by d4. In the Re-Lopez center game, white plays the immediate d4, black captures on d4, and now white could follow up by pushing his pawn on to e5. As it is, he doesn't play that yet, because if he plays the pawn onto e5 straight away, the black knight can come into e4 and then round to c5, attacking the loose bishop at a4. However, white still wishes to follow up with this plan, so he first plays the move rook f1 to e1. And then, say after black castles, white now plays pawn to e5. And the black knight has got less favourable squares to go to, either goes back to e8 or to d5. The Re-Lopez center game features early piece activity, and the idea of pawn control of the center is not so important. This concludes the material on side 1. If you turn over to side 2, you'll hear a talk on the Queen's Gambit.